Good evening from Istanbul. I'm Simla from Doğuş University, Department of English Language and Literature. Welcome to the third of our World Literature webinar series. This evening, I have the pleasure and the privilege of hosting two scholars of Turkish literature, Associate Professor Çimen GÜNAY ERKOL and Dr. Burcu ALKAN. Welcome, Çimen. Welcome, Burcu.
Hi.
Thank you for being here with me on this webinar. First of all, I'd like to remind our viewers that any remarks and questions will be most welcome. You may want to post them on the chat box during this webinar. We will try our best to respond to each one of them in the time allotted for this event. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about the academic backgrounds of our guests. Associate Professor Çimen GÜNAY ERKOL obtained her PhD degree from Leiden University in 2008 with a manuscript on the so-called March 12 novels of the post-coup period in 1970s Turkey. Her manuscript was published by Central European University Press in 2016 under the title Broken Masculinities. Together with Burcu ALKAN, she co-edited books on Turkish literature and its impact on world literature. She has been a member of the Initiative for the Critical Study of Men and Masculinities since 2013, and her fields of research are trauma, masculinity, and medical humanities. Currently, she and GÜNAY ERKOL co-edited another volume on Turkish literature titled as Turkish Literature as World Literature. And this book locates Turkish literature in the world literary scene as a source of influence and challenges the conventions in world and Turkish literary studies. Currently, she is working within the field of medical humanities with an interest in the relationship between literature and psychiatry, sciences of the mind, and mental health. So, we are going to use this book this evening to talk about the influence of Turkish literature on world literature. And congratulations, first of all, on this valuable contribution to the studies of world literature, Çimen Hocam and Burcu Hocam. Well, I'd like to start with some questions that come to mind when one sees the title Turkish literature as world literature. I want to focus on this proposition as. What does it mean to envisage Turkish literature as world literature? And how does such a perspective provide us with the theoretical tools necessary in studying world literature? Would you like to comment on that?
I guess I'll begin as the inventor of that silly title. Actually, this is an idea that came to our mind as well, like yourself, when we saw the call for papers or call for books of this Literatures as World Literature series by Bloomsbury. And we thought, okay, so if you want to talk about Turkish literature as world literature, what do we mean? Like, what does that as do to what we want to do? It's actually a simple question if you think about it. I mean, it's not like Turkish literature and the materials as Turkish literature change. Something's got to be happening to make that as worthwhile as a kind of a qualifier. So the question is really not about Turkish literature as world literature as such in that sense. It's about what world literature is. So it's one of the questions that we ask in terms of, how national literature or literature in a particular language becomes a world literature. I mean, what is going on? What is the dynamics of this kind of relationship between world literature and any national literature? So we actually found ourselves asking questions about what world literature is when trying to understand what we mean by Turkish literature as world literature. And obviously, we did some theoretical discussions regarding these definitions, etc., etc. I'm not going to get into the whole theory behind world literature. You already did a great webinar with Ian Almond, Simla, and you already talked about the different theories of world literature. So I don't see any purpose to that at this stage. And I'd actually like to focus on the Turkish literature part of it. So instead, maybe I can give a couple of examples of how we tackled some of the sort of significant world literature theories when we were doing Turkish literature as world literature. I mean, one of the critiques was, of course, revolving very much around this idea of center versus periphery, the so-called dichotomy, and how, of course, the scholars are kind of focused on decolonizing, decentering these ideas and these canons and whatnot, and how, if you think about it, or when we thought about it, we realized that even in cases where there is a decolonization or decentralization of these theories, it's not quite working that way all the time. So we thought maybe Turkish literature is in a great position to talk about Turkish literature, talk about world literature because of its, it's a bit of a cliche, but we are in the threshold, right? It's not just a geographical position; it's also a cultural position of the sort of so-called East and West and whatever. Whether you like it or not, the position of Turkish culture is already challenging in itself to these theories. So we will exploit this idea. One example I can give is, for instance, Franco Moretti's distance reading. We know that, or at least theoretically, we know that for Moretti, the whole point of world literature is distant reading, because you want to look at the world in terms of its literature, and he thinks that this whole close reading is besides the point, and it's difficult because, of course, you end up with a lot of material on a very limited set of works. And he is right. I mean, obviously, of course, not everybody can read everything, and yes, we do end up with a lot of work being done on very limited scope. But we had problems with that because, of course, it kind of dismisses the idea of, it kind of dismisses all the work being done by, translation studies people, by comparatists, by scholars of other literatures. And you do need that legwork to be done to be able to actually talk about a distant reading. Otherwise, somebody's going to do the work for us to be able to do the distant reading. So I think we kind of felt uncomfortable with the idea of just becoming a footnote. It also kind of brings the question of, if literary scholarship is not being done in the lingua francas like English or French, does it mean that it doesn't exist? I mean, all these things are taking place, all these discussions are probably taking place in the so-called peripheries as well. And this is some of the things we want on the show. So there's a lot of challenges to the idea of the center and periphery dichotomy, but also to the so-called, the decolonizing practices. I think I'm just going to give another example and sort of wrap it up with that. And that's, of course, another key figure, Pascal Casanova, talks about how, centrism is a problem, of course, in world literature. And she gives this idea, the position of Paris as sort of the center of world literature, and how that's also ideologically a problem. She calls it the Republic of Letters, the Greenwich Meridian of the Republic of Letters is Paris in this sense. And our book shows that whilst that's all happening nice and sweet in Paris and New York and London and places like that, there seems to be not much mention of another key international literary hub, and that's basically Soviet Moscow. So we have, for instance, 3 chapters on Nazım Hikmet that focus on the international left as a movement. And, yes, it has links with Paris, but the key hub is the USSR, is Moscow, and, the KU-TV where Nazım was a student. And there is actually some serious, if we are going to go with the dichotomy periphery discussion going on in terms of the internationalization of literature. And this is a truly international group, from all around the world. Communists from all around the world, but they are from all around the world. I'd like to I'd like to mention, for instance, a critic, Rosen Jagalov, and he, for instance, talks about Nazım. And if it's okay, I'd like to read a brief quotation from his piece on, what's happening in the Soviet KUTV, International Communist Exilic Literary and Cultural Sphere. So Jagalov quotes from a Palestinian writer, Necati Sıtkı, about the presence of Nazım and the Turkish literary figures in Moscow at the time. So he goes, this is Necati Sıtkı cross-quoted by Jagalov here. Each national group had its own activities. The most active was a Turkish group, which was headed by the poet Nazım Hikmet. He was a young man of 25 when I met him, tall with blonde hair and blue eyes and a ruddy complexion, constantly moving and full of energy. He used to wear golf pants and a jacket almost fully buttoned up, and would stand among the Turkish students declaiming revolutionary poems he had composed. So there is all this activity going on in Moscow at the KUTV. And then, of course, Nazım is a great world literature poet. And I think our book kind of shows how Turkish literature as world literature is already there, even if you don't want to look for it. So we have a chapter on, for instance, the relationship between Greece and Turkey through Nazım, Kenan Şahap's chapter, as an example of the so-called peripheries talking to each other, but as a political act, as a part of the literary internationalism. We also have a great chapter by Mediha Göbenli, who goes through Europe, Spain, Italy, East and West Germany, receiving Nazım separately, United States, and naming people like Pablo Neruda, of course, Paul Robeson, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, the Greenwich Meridian, if you think about it. And finally, we have a chapter, and we are pretty proud of that chapter as well, by the way, like all the other chapters. We have a chapter on Nazım's influence on Arabic poetry. And Mehmet Hakkı Suçin, who's a professor of Arabic literature, put together some examples from Palestinian poetry, Iraqi poetry, Egyptian poetry, and how translations of Nazım became a part of the revolutionary struggles of these communities. And I think that's also a great example in terms of our proposal against the whole distant reading or like the Greenwich Meridian discussions of what world literature should be. And that is basically world literature should be a collaborative affair. If we are going to be truly talking about world literature, we need to be talking about not centers or peripheries, but we need to talk about solidarity and working together. Different national literatures, different linguistic capabilities, different geographies, different fields, from comparativists to regions and regional and area studies. And I think, for instance, what we did with Mehmet Hakkı Suçin was an example of that, in the sense that his science language is Arabic and Turkish, and my science language is English and Turkish. So there's no way I can have access to his kind of material, and he wouldn't be accessible to a broader readership of the English-speaking world. So in the end, we worked together because we really wanted that chapter to be in the book. We worked together, and eventually I translated his chapter into English so that it could be included in the book. So we collaborated as two different comparativists, two different scholars of different languages and literatures, to bring together our argument of Turkish literature as world literature. So I'm just going to end by saying that what we wanted to really do was to show that Turkish literature is not just about being influenced by Western literatures in the modern times or Eastern literatures in the olden times, but that it actually influenced a lot of world literary traditions as well. And our book is trying to do that. And I think I spoke too much, so I'll just stop here.
It was great. Thank you very much. So I see that, theory and ideology are interrelated. and the book follows that. Yet I also sense that there is an ideological line of development in the book itself. Would you elaborate on that, Çimen?
Yes, with pleasure. We organized 12 chapters in 3 parts in this volume. And in the introduction, we clearly say that by no means this book is a coherent whole of Turkish literature. So we are very aware that we have left behind some very important names of Turkish literature, and they indeed equally make Turkish literature world literature. But the 3 parts, I think we start with a discussion of core and periphery. So this provides the entrance into our discussion of Turkish literature as world literature. And then we move to the border crossings. I will give you some more details in a while, but starting with the core periphery discussion and moving to how Turkish literature crossed national boundaries, finally we end up with the 3rd part, in which we have this more contemporary, the neoliberal, I might say, world literature as now the final scenario. So when I give you the details, you will probably see that we make a circular motion. We start with the Ottoman Empire, and then we end up with this today's melancholy for the Ottoman Empire, and that this makes our circular motion in this volume. If I may give some more details here, because we don't have all the contributors here with us today, let me drop some names. We start with Fatih Altuğ's chapter. This chapter is intended as an introduction to wider audiences who are not very familiar with the history of Ottoman Turkish literature. And Altuğ discusses, the title of his chapter is The Entangled History of Cosmopolitanism and Nationalism in Modern Turkish Literature. He discusses the beginnings of Ottoman literary modernity. This is a modernism born into a multi-ethnic empire, and there was a pluralistic literary field in the empire, so it was important for us to start with such a chapter. And Etienne Charrière follows Fatih in his chapter Translation, Transcription, and the Making of World Literature. This is another important chapter, in my opinion, because it takes the cultural political role of scripts at the explicit focus. And Etienne explores the coexistence and competition of scripts in the Ottoman Empire. They not only coexist, but they coexist in competition with each other, which is a very interesting thing to discuss in the Ottoman Empire's history. In the first part, we end with Joseph Twist's chapter. He expands this linguistic and script-wise border crossing discussion with Turkish-German writer Zafer Şenocak at his explicit focus. And he explores his links to the Sufi poet Yunus Emre. So the title of his chapter is Translating Yunus Emre, Translating the Self and Translating Islam, Zafer Şenocak's Turkish-German Path to Modernity. So overall, with all 3 chapters, I think in this part we include discussions of how the concept of world literature is negotiated in the Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. So with the multi-language and multi-script macrocosm of Ottoman Empire is introduced. And we move to the border crossings in the second part. The title of the second part is Turkish Literature in Transnational Waters. This is a difficult concept, transnationalism. So we have 5 chapters here, and Burcu mentioned some of them. We have 5 chapters, and out of 5, the three chapters out of 5 are on Nazım Hikmet. Here, the 5 chapters, they explore Ottoman Turkish subjects of the empire, but they explore them in a dialogue with their counterparts. So here we aim to deliver a discussion on how Turkish literature influenced its counterparts, not only in the West, but also in the North, as Burcu mentioned, in the Soviet Union, or in the East. For example, we have a very interesting chapter on Halide Edip and India, and the Arab world, as we previously talked about, exemplified by Mehmet Hakkı Suçen's chapter. But this part, it starts with Peter Cherry's chapter, World Literature as Performance. And if you're interested in the performativity theory, then you will obviously find this chapter very interesting. Peter deals with women's travel literature, travelogues, and he explores how this idea of harem produced stereotypical images of women that appeal to Western readership. So the performance of Turkishness is at his explicit focus. And of course, this performance is for British audiences. And this performance helps Peter to compare and contrast two women, Grace Ellison and Zeynep Hanım, two very interesting figures. Next, we have Shima Imshers and Aniruta Dhanavare's chapter, Halide Edip. The title of the chapter is Halide Edip on the Subcontinent. And they focus on Edip's trips to India, a specific trip to India, I should have said, 1935, I think, she travels to India. And they explore the appeal of Halide Edip in India, because India, by then, is a country struggling under European colonialism. And there, Halide Edip had a different impact, not only as a woman traveling, but also as a woman writing, as a woman, as a symbol of freedom. There she has an audience waiting for her. Finally, we have in this part 3 chapters on Nazım Hikmet. One is by Mediha Göbenli, Nazım Hikmet's reception as world poet. Mediha Hoca explores Nazım Hikmet in 2 different phases, and she discusses how his ideology becomes inseparable from his poetry. So when we start discussing Nazım Hikmet as a political figure, in as much as an aesthetic figure or a literary figure, here we can say that the history of Cold War also intervenes to our discussion of the history of Turkish literature and the history of Turkish literary canon. We have 2 more chapters on Nazım Hikmet. One is by Kenan Sharp and the other is by Mehmet Hakkı Suçin. Sharp's chapter looks at the case of Nazım Hikmet in Greece, it was very important for us to explore the communication between Turkey and Greece. This communication can be exemplified with many other literary figures, but Nazım Hikmet is one of them. And so Sharp focuses on the influence of Nazım Hikmet in Greece. He discusses how the communist movement helped Nazım Hikmet to increase his popularity, and how this solidarity kept the image of Nazım as a burning fire, let me say, never-ending fire. And building on this, we have Mehmet Hakkı Suçin's chapter. The title of his chapter is The Influence of Nazım Hikmet on Arab Poetry. Here a similar discussion takes place, but this time with Arabic Peninsula at the explicit focus. So Suçin discusses not only Palestinian poets, but Egyptian and Iraqi poets as well. And he shows that Nazım Hikmet crossed national boundaries, and he keeps crossing national boundaries, but not only with his translations, but also with his themes and techniques. And this again is another important dimension of our comparative look. And finally, in the third part, we finally turn to this neoliberal literary world of our days, I should say. So the title of the grand title of the third part is Contemporary Forms and Cosmopolitanisms. This part starts with Başak Çandar's chapter. The title of her chapter is World Literary Refractions, and she reads Orhan Pamuk and Juan Goytisolo in comparison. This comparative reading has both writers as national writers and global writers at the explicit focus. So Başak discusses how both Pamuk and Goytisolo denationalize the history of their own nations, their countries, how they complicate the notion of cultural negotiation that underlines the idea of world literature. And we have another chapter on Orhan Pamuk by Irmak Ertuna Hovison. She uses the Museum of Innocence in her lectures, and the title of her chapter is Teaching the Museum of Innocence in Arts and Design Context. So she discusses how Orhan Pamuk's novel serves as a hub, a gateway for her students to understand the global issues and cosmopolitanism of their days. Finally, your chapter, Simla DOİngün's chapter, is on Elif Şafak, and we have Kaitlin Stout here as the final two chapters. Now, with your chapters, we turn to institutions. I find this discussion very important, Simla. The turn to institutions such as literary academies, honors, and prizes. So, what makes Elif Şafak an icon of world literature is an important discussion. Simla DOİngün's title is Cultural Commodities of the Global Capital, Elif Şafak and Her Fiction. And Simla traverses Şafak's literary universe to discuss the ways her novels allude to major issues in world literature. And finally, we have Kaitlin's chapter, Literary Prizes and Political Culture in the New Turkey. So this term, New Turkey, is obviously invites some political discussion, and Kaitlin elaborates on this late melancholy for the Ottoman Islamist policies, which treat literature as a means to political cover to re-establish Turkey as a cultural center, but in the former Ottoman periphery. So, of course, we don't know yet if Turkey will be such a center or not, but we start our discussion with the Ottoman Empire as the birth of Ottoman literary modernism, and in this volume we end the discussion with the melancholy for the Ottoman modernity, with the cosmopolitanism and this former Ottoman peripheries, the appeal of this Ottoman periphery mentality in the current Turkish culture, I should say. And of course, this polarized culture and this polarized atmosphere is reflected in Elif Şafak as well. And perhaps you want to add a bit on top of this discussion with your discussions in the chapter.
Well, I'll do my best. And for that, actually, I need to go back to this introductory part, because that is where you claim, as the editors of the book, that presenting the history of Turkish literature in the world scene does not quite cover the scope of your project, of this book. And you actually wrote that, this is rather an attempt to show these points of connection in the process of Turkish literature's becoming world literature, as Burcu has said. So there are really these points that need to be reconsidered in the light of these chapters, such as Çimen has already suggested, actually, the role of literary prizes, as well as translation, perhaps some, theoretical concepts, right? And also geopolitics of the literary enterprise, as you mentioned. So it's thinking beyond the West. And not only this, but also thinking the influence of Turkish literature on world literature, which is by its very definition a Eurocentric concept. And so how can this be possible in this present political conjuncture? And I think, in a way, what you're doing is rather changing this direction of influence, in a way, rerouting global literary conversations, claiming that perhaps it is really necessary to return to these earlier discussions of world literature. And earlier discussions in the field on the history of world literature, as you say, they need to be revisited with that critical lens that is inspired by political hierarchies, as Burcu has suggested, that were frozen in the Cold War era. Indeed, I remember it's also Arif Dirlik who commented on this, when he said, that this term third world is actually a byproduct of modernization discourse in Euro-American social science that was really formulated in the 1950s, particularly in response to the entanglement of colonialism and anti-colonial movements in emerging Cold War that really kind of compelled the globe to division between these two major power blocks. So this resonates with Dirlik's arguments on the three worlds theory, where he says that it is actually a shifting idea, and says that when historical realities change, the conceptualization of the term changes as well. So if we situate, again, this book against this backdrop of Eurocentric theories, such as Casanova's, as you've said, and within contemporary debates of belonging and cosmopolitan attachments, I think Shafak's writing speaks to relevant issues in world literature. And if I'm to use Erdal Göknaz's verse, he actually says that Şafak is one of those authors who can be considered as the first generation to grow up within the neoliberal system that was established after the 1980 coup. And thus we can say that Şafak's writing, in a way, represents this new thread that locates Turkish literature as world literature. And what Şafak writes about, in terms of these thematic strands in her fiction, they show also that this kind of writing is more strategic in terms of resisting, this idea. And it also works on an individual level, perhaps not like, those chapters in which the contributors focused on Nazım Hikmet's influence. But I argue that, her writing is more in tune with the, zeitgeist and more conscious of this multidimensionality of power mechanisms that operate in the world republic of letters and that really influence authors' choices. And in this sense, I think this last section of the book can be seen in a way in tandem with this new relationality to which Turkey belongs at present. So we see new ways of defining identity. And in a sense, we can also relate this to Salman Rushdie, what he said in his 10 lectures when he labeled this as a boundary, in the center-periphery sense. And when he sided with this potential that is inherent in kind of escaping geographical, cultural, and linguistic lines. And in that way, this also, we can say that this means also forming new affiliations and henceforth, having that influence. And in this chapter of mine, I analyzed two of Şafak's novels, The Saint of Incipient Insanities and The 40 Rules of Love, a novel of Rumi. And I argue that Elif Şafak's writing is actually a peculiar case. And why peculiar? You see, the world literary market has been showing a growing interest in Şafak. And her novels have been translated into many languages, 40 languages, and they were published by some of the world's leading press. And at the same time, she receives gradual criticism by critics. And I use this peculiar positioning of Şafak as a tool, in my chapter. And I, as Çimen said, I chose to give this chapter the title of Cultural Commodities of the Global Capital. And here I really analyze these theoretical concepts like hybridity and cosmopolitanism, those two popular, buzzwords, concepts that are frequently used by Elif Şafak to articulate both her identity and also her works in the discussions on world literature. And these concepts are embedded within the theoretical discourse of the politics of resistance against globalization. But then again, there is also criticism directed towards them for being informed by elitist and Eurocentric approaches. So I draw from these two aspects to see how they speak to the major issues of world literature and to analyze to what extent Şafak and her works themselves become cultural commodities of the global capital. And after all, world literature is kind of an elusive term. There is no one and only way to characterize good or correct world literature. So this link between Şafak's fiction and world literature can be seen then in her continuous repositioning in the face of these global issues, particularly the ones that are related to belonging. That was actually what I had in mind when I was writing on Shafak's work, because she received a lot of criticism. That's something that's worth mentioning.
May I add a tangent to what you've been saying, Simla? Because I just thought of it now. It's kind of interesting to look back at all these chapters that we read and reread many, many times, and sort of remembering them again in a discussion like this. What you were saying about Elif Shafak and any writer that is any Turkish writer that's globally widely read, like that includes Orhan Pamuk as well, should probably be discussed in terms of the evolution of the idea of cosmopolitanism. Because when I think about writers like Elif Shafak, I can't help but think about cosmopolitanism. But being trained as a modernist, for me, cosmopolitanism is something else. It's that turn of the century, a la Stefan Zweig kind of, cosmopolitanism. So it's kind of, I think it's kind of imperative or it would be very interesting too, I think, to discuss the evolution of the concept of cosmopolitanism as a part of world literature from sort of the Zweigian times to Shafakian times in a way, in the way that one could talk about the idea of Weltliteratur that Erik Auerbach proposed, at the very beginning of the whole line of theory, as far back as even Goethe, of course. Goethe's Weltliteratur was a part of that as well. And today how it became this neoliberal idea of, we really need to differentiate between global literature and world literature, because global literature is talking about the world literature in relation to neoliberal market structures with publication industries and translation industries, something we haven't talked about in this presentation, but it is a part of our book. It's a part of the introduction as well. Versus world literature, which I personally would like to think of sort of more along the lines of what David Damrosch proposes in terms of literature that travels. And I think there's an intellectual difference between the cosmopolitanism of Zweig and neoliberal cosmopolitanism of today, and the Weltliteratur of the old and modern times, and what it has become today, whereby neoliberalism differentiated between global literature and world literature as two different concepts. Essentially, if you think about it, they sound like they are the same, but they are not. So I think there's another chapter that we could have included.
Now that we're thinking.
Yeah. now that it's over and I'm less traumatized about the publication process, I think I can rethink certain things.
Yeah, this starting point is really important, right? That Ansatzpunkt, right?
Yeah.
And it is really something that keeps this thing going. Well,
it clearly shows that what we've done, talking about Turkish world literature, is only the beginning of something that is basically a rich, fertile ground that needs to be sort of dug up more. So we are hoping there will be more works like this. We are hoping that it won't be Çimen and I this time, doing the legwork for a change. But yes, I think our book is a starting point, and I think there's a lot of potential there. And let's talk about world literature as collaboration, and let's try and see what could be brought together. Exactly. And thank you for having us over here to voice our opinions as such.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a really pleasure for me. And I was actually wondering about the role of translation, because it is something that has a say in all this, in all these discussions pertaining to world literature. Any ideas, any comments that you can, Burcu or Çimen, can make about it? I mean, the role of translation in, for example, in this book, you already mentioned, Burcu, that you translated one chapter And also, there are many works that are still waiting for translation, being to be translated from Turkish to English. Of course, we see that they are gradually being translated, but obviously it is not as much as we want them to be, right?
It's not only a question of amount, I'm afraid. I mean, lots of people are putting lots of efforts for translation. Recently, I came across an article in Los Angeles Review of Books by Nick Glastonbury. He is the translator of Sema Kaygusuz, if I'm not wrong. And the title of his essay was Translating Against World Literature. So people are making tremendous efforts to translate national literatures into world literatures. But I mean, Nick talks about the number of rejection emails he had received. And even after Sema Kaygusuz's translation won an important translation prize, I mean, he had experienced problems with editors and publishers and etc. So for translation is obviously the first step of everything. But even if you have your translation in your hands, it becomes another problem to enter the world literature.
Yeah.
So maybe
I mean, I have a personal experience with that. It's I translated a novella by Murat Gülsoy, and just as I was negotiating potential, publication pathways, COVID hit, and everything, of course, stopped, because most of these global literature publishers are small publishers. They're boutique publishers, as we would call in Turkey. And of course, something like a pandemic like this hit them economically quite a bit. So like that whole thing stalled. And yeah, I am sure there are many such translations just sitting and waiting for the right time. But it's very important, and I think Çimen would have more to say about this, but translation is the key access point. It's the gateway to world literature. So it's, I think it is a very important part of, the canon building processes of world literature, but also like canon building processes of translated works as world literature. And of course, there are a lot of ideological and market-oriented issues around that. I mean, most of the time, the choices of rejection, which I am very familiar with, and acceptance are, yes, ideological, but more importantly, not very intellectually or aesthetically driven. It ends up all about being money, really, if you think about it. But I think Çimen has more details about these processes.
Well, I have, in the introduction, we included some details about the TEDA project, the Translation of Turkish Literature, Translation and Publication Grant Program of Turkey. And we were curious about the languages that Turkish literature is being translated into. And according to their statistics, among the languages that received support from the TEDA project, the top 6 languages are Bulgarian, Arabic, German, Albanian, Persian, and then English. So Turkish literature is kind of not via those translations. It's kind of talking to its perhaps geographically near, let's say, counterparts. But with translations into German and translations into English, then that means it's a great pace towards Europe, towards Central Europe, and probably more and more will come. But translation is, hard business. I'm not as experienced as Burcu, so it takes lots of efforts.
But I think we also need to, think about what it does to world literature as well. Not just, the gateways maybe, but we have 2 chapters who show how translation becomes the, sort of the maker of world literature. Like in Arabic poetry, we know that Nazım's impact came through first translations from other languages, and then later directly through Turkish literature, the Turkish language. And also we know that the translations of Yunus Emre becomes a cross-cultural communication point in this sort of diasporic German context. So, I mean, translation and world literature is not just about markets and gateways, but it is also a part of the process that enriches or makes possible that idea, the very idea of world literature. I mean, obviously, of course, the market problems are the market problems, but I think there's still a lot to be gained in collaboration if there's more collaboration between, you know, translation studies and, you know, the publishing sector. I mean, so much of this is through scholarship anyway. Like you were saying, Çimen, about how Turkish literature was being discussed in scholarship before it was translated, right? In the 70s in places like the United States.
Yes.
That kind of scholarship initiated the translations. I mean, scholars from Turkey who found positions in European American institutions, they were working on the texts without any translations. Even before the entrance of translations to the world literary market, they were working on those texts, and the scholarship on those texts kind of initiated the translations. Sometimes it happens the way around. So, but we have to work on both sides, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, literary prizes, they go, you know, hand in hand with the process of translation. If you're not translated, then you don't have the opportunity to get even, you know, nominated for a prize, especially in English, right? And it is obviously is something really related, you know, something that we can never really think apart from translation. And I believe that there are also I think it was Caitlin's chapter on particularly Aslı Erdoğan's, right, work. And she also mentioned, you know, that also this, you know, changing positions, you know, in terms of course, the change that you've already suggested in the neoliberal policies, right, the neoliberal policies in Turkey. And so it gets even more difficult when you're not translated into that language precisely, not like Orhan Pamuk or, you know, others who actually were already nominated, right? Well, I'm asking Arabe if we have any questions, and I see that there are none, but if they are interested, if the audience or the readers, let's say, are interested, they can, I think, reach us through emails, right? And well, there's so much more to talk about, really. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
It's nice to be able to talk about our book at such a great length, because I think this is the first English public event we did, and it's kind of nice that you are one of the writers, so it's more like a conversation than an interview as such, I guess.
Thank you for being with me, and we can say that, you know, perhaps we can end this webinar if we don't have any questions. And I'll see. No. All right, then. Well, thank you for being with me again. And thank you, viewers, for being with us this evening at this webinar. And goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.